Okay, so this is part three of our Artist Alley 101 series. And if you guys have not yet watched part one or part two, and want to, they are available actually on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, because Twitch only saves videos for 14 days after you stream it. And I do these once a week. So I figured putting it on YouTube is probably a little bit easier. I'll put it on Twitch sometime though, later. Once I have finished going through the entire like series, I'll probably put it up on Twitch. Yeah. But for now, it's on YouTube. So if you guys are interested, part one talked about a quick introduction to Artist Alley and some considerations to make when you're making products. And part two talks about what did I talk about? Oh, part two talked about, I think, applying for conventions. So things like the application system, portfolios, stuff like that. And then the third part, which is the stuff that we'll talk about today, is going to be all about the preparation for the convention. Let me change this into the lecture mode. Oh, yay. So smooth. Smooth transitions. Okay. Okay. So, again, we're going to be talking about preparing for the convention. If you guys have questions, just type them whenever you think of it, and I'll kind of answer them or comment on them as we go. So I'll try to get to all the comments. And I love questions if you guys think there's something that I didn't talk about enough, or there's a similar topic that you want to kind of hear about, just let me know and we'll get started. I think we'll only be able to cover preparing for the convention. If we have a little bit more time, I might cover a little bit of the actual like selling at the convention part. Um, but my guess is that we're not gonna get that far because I take very long on these slides. I talk a lot. I'm sorry. So as before, I have slides, but they're not really necessary. I'll probably just talk through everything. So you can kind of treat it as a podcast and just kind of chill and listen while you guys are working on something else or something like that. So yeah, let's get started. So if you have already applied for a convention, or you've just applied and you just want to get started, we can just go straight into actually preparing for the convention. And some things to know beforehand is that starting up a convention like route or career or whatever can be really expensive. So here I just have some numbers that I personally dealt with when I was just starting out. So things like the setup, which we will talk a little bit about. So this would be the stuff that you would bring to a convention, the things that you put on your table to make your products look nice and everything like that. So that can cost anywhere from $50 to $200 depending on the type of stuff that you get. Craft tools, things like pliers, rulers, nice scissors, tape, stuff like that, those can be anywhere from $5 to $20 each. So if you have a lot of them, that can start to really add up. If you get machines, so things like button machines, sticker cutters, printers, anything like that, those can, you know, be 50 to 200. Some of them are more expensive than that. My Tecker button machine is itself like $200. Um, and then on top of that, you have to kind of consider the startup inventory. So, you know, the prints or the crafts, anything that you start out with, you have to consider as part of your startup costs. And so this stuff is not necessarily here to like scare you guys or anything like that. It's just a realistic look at kind of the stuff that you should prepare yourself to purchase in order to get started in the artist alley. So make sure you keep track of these costs, because even if it's like little things like if you buy one plier this day, if you buy another plier the next day, they can really start to add up. And so it's really important to make sure that your costs are what you think they are. You don't want to suddenly go home to a credit card bill of like $2,000 of artist alley stuff. So keep track of those. And also, all of these are considered deductibles for your business expenses. And so when you are doing your taxes for the next for that year, all of these are considered business costs. So they go in part of the deductibles. So it's a good idea to keep all the receipts, keep track of them so you can write them off. Okay, so let's get into some of the more details of the stuff. So let's talk inventory. So the most important thing to prepare when you are starting out with a convention is the inventory, because obviously you can't show up at a convention if you don't have the goods to sell. um, and so uh, usually for inventory, when you're just starting out, if it's your first con, second con, maybe you're just kind of testing the waters, it's a good idea to generally keep lower quantities. Um, if you have too much of one thing and you have a lot of extras, um, you might not have a use for them later. For example, if you sell one item and then you realize that you wanted to print it in a different way, or you just maybe don't really like the product, or you made improvements on it, if you have all of this other stuff left over, unfortunately, that's cost that you're never going to um, turn into profit. So it's generally more safe to start out with lower quantities. So these are some basic numbers that I have. Again, this is everything here is my own personal experience. So what is like right or correct or general for me might not be the same for you. So everybody should do their own research, but these are some of the numbers that I use. So for prints, I bring anywhere from 5 to 20 prints to a convention of one design. I have personally never sold more than, I think, 25 of a single design at a convention. Um, if you're just starting out, I would suggest maybe like 10 of each design. And honestly, if you run out of a print at a convention, usually you can go to like FedEx or Staples or Office Max or any local printers that work on the weekends to print more of it. That's something that I usually do if I am not really confident in how much that print would sell. Then I would just make sure to bring the electronic files on like a USB or something, and then hop over to like a Minuteman or something, get those printed if I ever sell out of a print. But if you bring too much, that's a lot of weight that you're just kind of carrying around. And it's just kind of more work for yourself and more upfront costs. So yeah, 5 to 20 I think is a good number. For charms or other smaller items like that, generally I think 5 to 15 is a pretty good number. The most charms of like a single design that I've ever sold at a con, I think it's like 15. I don't think I've ever sold like one design more than 15. So again, if you bring a lot, that's just a lot of bulk and a lot of weight that you're carrying around, especially if you're flying or you're taking a bus and the luggages have like a limit weight. It can really start to pile up. So if you're not really sure, start out with a lower quantity. Um, a good rule to kind of follow is to think of how much money um, you would make if you sold out of everything that you bring. And then kind of see if that number that you come up with is realistic. So let's say you brought 10 different artworks, 10 prints each, and that would be a total of 100 prints total. And if you are selling them at an average, let's say, of about $10 per print, that's about $1,000. And so that seems like a pretty realistic number that you might be able to do. Whereas if you decided to bring 50 um, of each design, and there's 10 designs, and you have like 500, then if you sold out of everything, that's like $5,000 in just prints, which is definitely doable. It's just frankly not a common number if you're just starting out. So just kind of look at it from that perspective. Think of how much money you would want to make, and then kind of bring that and make sure it's kind of like a realistic-ish number. But again, these numbers, the 5 to 20 for prints and 515 for charms and other little items, these are all really dependent on each artist, each convention, what time period the convention is, where your table is. Uh, it really varies. And so these numbers are just kind of guidelines for you to start off with. And once you do a couple more cons, then you'll kind of start to see a trend in which prints you'll sell more of, how many of that print you'll sell depending on, the number of attendees that are there, and stuff like that. So again, when you're just starting out, lower quantities are a little bit easier to work with, but you can kind of go from there based on your experience. Okay, so once you have your inventory, you also need to bring packaging. So packaging is like little bags that you can put prints or charms and stuff like that when you're actually selling it to the person. So usually if you're selling prints or crafts or stuff like that, you don't generally just give the item to them without any kind of like packaging or wrapping. Unless it's something like plush, a lot of times plush will just come as is, which is fine. But something like prints um, usually have a plastic bag. And it used to be that it wasn't completely necessary, but I think in the last like 5 to however many years, it's something that almost every single artist at a convention has done, is to sell their prints and then give them like a plastic sleeve or bag or whatever to put it in. And so it's gotten to a point where it is almost expected out of every single artist. And I have seen cases where um, maybe I will like run out of a bag, and at the end of the convention, I'm just like selling prints and being like, hey, I'm sorry, I don't have any more of the sleeves. And then I've seen those kind of people like walk around and be like, hey, like to other artists and be like, hey, do you have any sleeves that I could have? And stuff like that. So sleeves just makes everything look a little bit more professional and also protects the artwork. Um, if somebody is spending money to buy your artwork, they really like it, they probably want to protect it too. So sleeves are a really good idea. For small items like charms or bookmarks and stuff like that, a lot of times they do come in the bags. They're not quite as necessary, I think, as it is for prints. But I do see a lot of times they come in like these little cute little bags so that they're not just like on its own. The exception to this is there are cases where people just want to put it on right away, like pin back buttons or like keychains, and they're just like, oh yeah, I just want it right now. In those cases, they might specifically say, oh, I don't need a bag. But um, usually, it's not a bad idea to give charms and things like that in a small bag. Um, so the only thing that you really have to make sure for the sleeves and the plastic bags is that your items actually fit. So if you are buying plastic sleeves for your prints, let's say your prints are letter size or like I think that's A4, A4. So like 8.5 by 11 inches. If you get plastic sleeves that are just exactly 8.5 by 11, it's probably going to be really hard to fit your print in it, just because it's like the exact size. It's like ultra skinny jeans or something like that. And so usually it's a good idea to get something that's a tiny bit bigger, so maybe like 8 8 3/4 of an inch by 11.5 inches or something like that. Go a little bit bigger, so it makes it easier for you to put the prints into the bag. So plastic bags and stuff like that, you can buy them at Amazon, you can buy it at eBay. Clear bags is a good one that I personally use to buy all of my sleeves. Another good one is Uline, which is a packaging company, and they sell a lot of these in like really big bulk. So let me see if I actually have some plastic sleeves, just so the ones who are watching the video can kind of take a look. Aha, here it is. So this is like the kind of sleeves that I'm talking about. Ta-da! So yeah, it's just like this flat plastic like bag that you can put things in. A lot of them come with this like adhesive. So this is like, if you pull this strip off, it has an adhesive and you can fold the flat over once you've put the prints in it. But honestly, I think the adhesive isn't too necessary. If you put a print in there, um, usually the prints don't come falling out even if you don't have it closed. But yeah, that's what they kind of look like. Um, so yeah, again, for packaging, I think prints, you should really get packaging. It's a lot of times um, almost necessary. In small bags, it's kind of optional, but I think it makes everything a little bit more professional if you have a bag to give to your customers. Okay, so now let's talk about setup. So setup is basically how you want to lay out your products and your crafts at the actual convention. So if you don't have a huge online following or something, if you are at a convention, the only thing that you have to kind of show everybody is your artwork and your setup. And so it can make a really big difference um, in the impression of the attendees as they walk by your table. So the most important thing about your setup is to make everything visible. So nothing is like hidden, and everything is just kind of easy to see. So the trend right now, at least in the anime conventions, because I've seen it kind of differ in the Comic Cons. It can get a little bit different. So at least for anime cons, the trend right now is that if you have prints, you kind of pull them upwards, and so they're kind of in this like big gallery behind your table or above your table, so that somebody who's walking by can kind of look at it almost like a gallery. And it's generally not a good idea to have them kind of on the table. It used to be, I think, like back like a decade ago or something, that it was really common for people to have just binders full of art, and then people would kind of walk around, go through the binders and stuff like that. That's something that's not done anymore, or that's at least not in the anime convention scene. It's not really done. Um, Usually you have most of your prints up, and then separately you have a catalog of art that you might want to show. But if you have your prints up, it makes it really easy to see. It catches people's eyes. If people are just walking by, they get a really quick glance of the kind of artwork that you have available. Um, if you have craft items or like charms, notebooks, things like that, it's really important that you have different levels on your table, so that the things in the front aren't blocking the view for the things in the back. So it a good idea to have is like these like staircase kind of displays, so that everything is kind of cascading and visible. And again, that's really the same reason as for the prints. It just makes it really easy for somebody who's walking by to kind of glance at your table, see what you have, and if they're interested, they can come and ask you more about it. So here I just have a quick image. You have your print over here and the top. Usually the items are kind of raised off the table, and then you have the actual table itself, which sometimes comes with a tablecloth, but oftentimes it doesn't. So it's a really good idea to bring your own tablecloth, so that it kind of looks a little bit more professional and covers up whatever's underneath your table. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Let me just get that laser pointer going. Okay, that makes it a little bit easier to see. Okay, so I already said that usually prints are raised up vertically above your table, but now I'll talk about kind of how it's usually done. So prints are generally kind of taped together in tiles behind you. So if you have like 5 prints in a row, you just kind of like tape them together and tape them up on top of like whatever holster you have to lift up the prints. There are definitely a lot of other ways to do it. I've seen people like print out just one big sheet of all of their prints. I've seen people like laminate their prints and then punch holes in it so that they have like binder rings. So these are all things that you can do, but the most simple way and by far the most common way I've seen people put up prints is tape. So here I just have like a quick picture. Where's my mouse? Quick picture of what it might look like from the back. So if these are your prints, usually you kind of want to tape them together in a way where they won't like move around and flap. Um, if you are using tape, it's a good idea to like tab the ends of the tape so that when you are done and you don't want to keep these prints stuck together or something like that, you can peel them pretty easily off the edges if they're tabbed like that. So some of the things that are really good to use, if you are using paper prints, masking tape is like amazing. It is, of course, not the most durable of tapes, but it generally lasts pretty well throughout the con, and it makes it pretty easy for tear down later on. And if you are using like laminated display prints, which is a good idea if you just want one set of like display pieces that you want to use throughout your entire convention career or something like that. Or if you have metallic coated prints, things that have like a glossy layer on it, those you can actually use clear tape. I personally use clear packaging tape, like the really thick, like 2-inch ones that you can get at like Target or Walmart or whatever. And you can use those to tape it up also. Those are generally a little bit stronger. So if it's not paper, I would suggest using clear tape. Some of the stuff that you probably should avoid is something like duct tape, which is really, really, really adhesive. um, you're probably never going to get your print back if you use duct tape. Even if you get the tape off, you might have like residue left on the surface of your print. So if you ever want to reuse those prints, duct tape is probably not a good idea. Another generally bad idea is painter's tape. So painter's tape at first glance looks like masking tape, but painter's tape is built in a way where it tears very easily and in like really nice straight lines. And so in my personal experience, when I've used painter's tape, all of my display starts ripping down from their own weight after a while. So I don't recommend it. Just regular masking tape, not painter's tape, is probably a better idea. Um, so yeah, again, there's a lot of different ways to hang up your prints. This is just the most common way that I've seen, and honestly, the cheapest way is to just tape up your prints. So, but do whatever works for you. If you want to laminate your artwork and use the same ones over and over again, that's perfectly fine. There's just a lot of ways to do it. Okay, so now I'm going to show a couple setups that I have personally had and kind of talk about the actual build that's behind each of these setups. I will say, as a quick disclaimer, my setups are not the prettiest. I am really, really slow at setting up, and so a lot of times I end up just kind of putting up much stuff as I possibly can. So in terms of aesthetic, I would say just go with whatever you want. Just note that I am kind of showing the actual build that you might have in an artist alley. So the first one that I want to talk about is PVC pipes. So PVC pipes in this picture are these like white pipes. I don't know if my laser pointers work. Yeah, okay. So these pipes in the back here. So these are, I think, technically considered plumbing pipes, but they can be cut into like whatever lengths you want if you have a cutter, or if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, a lot of times they'll actually have a cutter there, and you can kind of cut it on the spot. Um, and you can just buy these like little corner pieces, these connectors, and honestly, just build whatever you want. So some of the really good advantages is it is generally really straightforward. It's just pipes and connectors. You just kind of stick them together, and generally it holds. It is relatively cheap. So I can't remember exactly how much they were, but I think like one piece of like 10 feet long. When I get them, they're maybe like two, three, $4. It's relatively cheap, and they can really easily be broken down. You can, because they're PVC, it's plastic. You can kind of cut them into whatever sizes you want. So I've actually seen people who have cut down their pipes to like 1 foot sections, so that they can just shove it in their suitcase, and fly with it, and all they need to do at a convention is just kind of put them all back together again. So they're pretty easy to use. When I first started, PVC pipes were what I used to kind of holster up all of my prints. So some of the cons of PVC pipes, it is that depending on how you build it, it can be not very sturdy. So you kind of have to make sure that you can engineer it to be kind of structurally sound. And if you Google like PVC setup at conventions or something on Google, there's a lot of examples that you can kind of follow. So I really recommend you guys do that if you do decide to go with PVC pipes. If you don't build it the right way, depending on how the weight is distributed on that PVC pipe, it could very easily fall over. And you don't want that because you don't want to damage your prints, you don't want to hurt anybody. So just kind of be careful. Um, if you are uh, putting up your PVC pipes, it's often also a good idea to clamp those PVC pipes to your table. So you can buy these giant clamps to clamp onto your table. Actually, I think I have some. Give me one sec. Uh, dun 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 dun. Okay, so these are kind of the clamps that I'm talking about. This is an Irwin Quick Grip. Quick Grip. I hope that you guys can see that. So these parts, basically, it's just a giant big clamp, and a lot of times what people will do is you have your PVC pipe and there's a pipe down here that's horizontal on top of your table, and you just kind of like clamp that down onto your table. So if you don't necessarily have to do that, but if you do that, it makes your structure a lot more sound. So I really recommend it. You can buy them at like any hardware store. Um, so the other disadvantage of the PVC pipes is that if it's not built in exact dimensions, it can be really sloppy looking. So if you have one side that is like 5 feet tall and the other side is like 5 feet and 2 inches, even if it's a little bit, you can kind of tell, and it starts to look a little bit sloppy. So just be careful. The other thing is that a lot of PVC pipes will have things printed on them, or things like barcodes or things like the size. Really like administrative stuff that the hardware store probably had to keep track of when they were selling it. And so I never covered mine up, but there are a lot of people who do prefer to cover it up, either paint it or like put like really cute masking tape on it or something like that, washi tape on it, to make it look cute, because otherwise it can kind of look a little bit sloppy. So, so this is one way to put up all of your prints. I do want to also show um, grid cubes. So grid cubes are these mesh kind of cage looking things on where you see like my smaller items here, like here and things like that. And so these essentially are just these squares of grids. That's exactly what they are. They're just grid squares. And they have like these little corner connectors where you can connect different grid squares with each other to build basically any sort of structure that you can think of. And these are really good for adding level to your table if you have like plushies or soaps or any kind of crafts or these kind of like little charms or bags or stuff like that that you probably really can't see from far away if it's just flat on the table. It's a really good idea to kind of use these grid cubes to lift them up. And let me actually just pull out a better picture where it doesn't have all of my stuff on it. Grid cubes. Something like these. So this is exactly what it is. So basically it's just these little squares and these connectors come off, and so you can get really creative with all sorts of shapes and structures that you want to make with these grid cubes. So some people will build them really, really high, like really high off the table, and they'll actually put their prints on it. In my case, I've just used it kind of at a lower level to put my items, but if you just want to use grid cubes, that's definitely a possibility, and you can put your prints on that as well. Some of the advantages to have grid cubes, I've already talked a little bit about this, but there's a lot of possible configurations. They tend to be pretty sturdy because these grids are made of metal. There are some that I've seen that are made of plastic, but I don't have any personal experience with it, so I can't say very much about them. Um, some of the disadvantages of them are because they're steel, they can be really heavy to transport. And you do need quite a bit of these squares in order to make your structure sound or to build them high. And so you'll need to bring quite a bit of them if you want to use grid cubes. And that weight can really add up. So if you are flying, if you are, taking the megabus where there's a luggage weight limit, it might not be such a good idea. So I actually only bring my grid cubes to conventions where I drive. I almost never bring them to conventions where I have to fly just because of the weight limit, and they're just really heavy. Um, the other disadvantage of these is that you can build grid cubes up to a certain height, and as I've mentioned, a lot of people do that and put posters up, but you can't build it really high. You can't build it beyond like 5 feet, I think. Beyond that, it starts to kind of, because all of the pieces are very heavy, it starts to like kind of buckle in on its own weight. So that's something that you might need to watch out for. And the final disadvantage of grid cubes is that they are time consuming to set up and tear down. So all of these connectors, they're connecting like 4 or 5 or 6 of these grid squares at a time. And you need a lot of energy and a lot of time to put them together and take them apart because they do need to be tight enough that they're structurally sound. So unfortunately, they're pretty time consuming, but they can do a lot of different configurations. If you're just starting out and you want to just drive to a couple local conventions for the first year or two or something like that, grid cubes might be really good. And they're really great for merchandise and things like that when you want to lift things off the table. So, okay, so moving on to the next possible uh, setup item. um, is a photography stand. So this is something that is A little bit more recent, I would say I didn't really see them maybe like 3 years ago, but it's starting to get really, really popular. So these are basically, as the name implies, they are photography backdrop stands. So whenever you guys went to school and took your school pictures and stuff, there's this background of like gray camo looking things. And so that camo looking fabric thing that is hanging off of one of these photography backdrop stands. Uh, and so you can just the same way lift up all of your prints and hang them down that way. So in this picture, this black thing you see here, back here, goes all the way down. That is a photo backdrop stand. So some of the advantages of these is that these are pretty heavy duty. So if you look at the type of backdrops that they are really built for, a lot of these photo backdrops are really heavy and they kind of like really drape down. And so they're really built to be able to hold up a good amount of weight. They're usually made of metal. In fact, I don't think I've actually seen a photo backdrop stand that's not made of metal, um, but I'm not 100% sure. So they're usually made of metal. They're pretty heavy duty. Another advantage is that they can be built to be very high. So this will depend on the type of photo drop or photo backdrop stand that you buy, but you can buy some that can go up to like 10 feet tall. Mine personally, I think, oh, actually, no, sorry. Mine personally goes up to about 7 feet, but I think the maximum I've ever seen is like 13 feet or something like that. But you can have these sticks on the side go up pretty high with pretty good structural stability, which is really nice if you have a lot of prints or if you have a lot of big stuff that you kind of want to show off. I will mention that there are some conventions that have a height limit. So some conventions will say you can't go beyond more than 5 feet off the table. And that is just to make sure that nothing is falling on top of anybody. Because especially for PVC pipes or grid cubes, if you build it beyond that height, it can start to get a little bit wobbly. So it's a safety precaution. And so just make sure that that is something that you will need to follow. And back to photograph backdrop stands. uh, One more advantage of these stands is that they are really easy to set up. So the way they work is that they have two tripods on each side and a metallic bar on the top. So usually what happens is you shorten your tripods to kind of like a comfortable level, put your metal bar on it, and then start putting your prints like one layer by one layer and then kind of raise both ends as you go. And so compared to PVC pipes or grid cubes where you have to physically put the stand or the structure together, the photograph stands are really easy to set up. The disadvantage of these is that they are bulky and heavy. So a lot of times the photograph, sorry, photo backdrop stands can only shrink to a certain size. I think mine only shrink down to about 3 feet, I think, in length, which means that it actually doesn't fit in my suitcase. So I have to carry it around as my carry-on instead. So they are pretty big. They are also pretty heavy because it's a lot of metal, sticks and parts. So they can get pretty heavy if that's something that you are worried about. And one of the biggest disadvantages that it has is that it requires floor space. So unlike grid cubes or PVC pipes where the structure itself is sitting on top of your convention table, a photograph backdrop stand has tripods and those need to be on the ground. I mean, you could put it on the table, but that sounds really, really dangerous and probably not a good idea. So they have to stand up off the ground, and I will talk a little bit about this a couple slides later. But uh, space is very limited in a artist alley, and so if you have these photograph tripods, that's space that is taking up that you can't put your stuff. So if you need a lot of space behind your table, like if you have a lot of big bulky items like t-shirts or things like plush, these backdrop stands might not be a good idea because they do take up floor space. And that's also one thing that a lot of conventions may be pretty strict about, is that you have to make sure that all of your displays and all of your items are within the allotted space that you are given. And so you have to make sure that your backdrop stands actually fit within that space. So none of the legs are kind of like poking out. If they poke out, that is a trip hazard. People will hit it. I've personally had a space where it was a corner and my tripod legs were sticking out, and literally like every 30 minutes somebody would hit it and my display would kind of wobble. And so I try to put like my blanket and like a big warning sign on it, and I think that kind of helped. But things like that happen, so those are things to keep in mind. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about the big items that you can use to set up your table, we can talk about some of these smaller items. So this is kind of a zoom in on a table that I had at Acon in Texas. So you can really get creative with the type of stuff that you can use to show off all of your merchandise. So things that are kind of on your table, which might not be easy to show off as just hanging up. So just kind of going in order back here. Oh, where is my laser pointer? Oh, here it is. Okay, so back here, I have charms and note holders, or basically these little hanging decorations. These are all hung up on a cork board, which is being hung up on my photo stand. So these are basically just pinned into the corkboard with little thumbtacks. On the bottom here, I have this collapsible little organizer that has these little pockets where I put, here I have notebooks, here I have little washi tapes and stuff like that. I also have these easels here. Those are mainly for showing off like signs, which I'll also come back to, but signs are really important, and easels and stuff like that are a really good way to make sure they're visible to the customer. Here I have little collapsible boxes. They fold flat when they are in my suitcase, and then you can just kind of pop them open. And that is, I think, a trend that you'll see in all of my stuff, is that everything is collapsible or portable, because I tend to run out of space very easily in my suitcase, and so I try to make sure things are uh, not bulky as much as I can. So the last one right here, this is called a riser. It's just these little steps that I kind of mentioned earlier. This is actually home built. I basically followed some designs that I found on the internet and cut out from poster board these little sections. So this actually comes apart and becomes like a set of 6 poster board pieces, and you can just kind of put them together and turn them into a riser. So these are just some ideas. Obviously, there's much more aesthetic and much more efficient ways of showcasing your products that I have not done. So these are just some ideas to kind of get you started on thinking about how to showcase your stuff. So I mentioned that I wanted to talk about signs. So here I've kind of desaturated the picture so it's easier to see these circles. Every single one of these circles on this photo here is a sign. And signs are really important at your table. It is a really good way to tell the customer how much the item is. If you have any interesting, backstory about that item, basically anything that you want the customer to know, you should probably have on a sign. And A lot of times people are a little bit shy at a convention and they might not want to ask directly to you how much something is. And so if you have a sign, it makes it really comfortable. They can kind of look around to see how much something is. Or if they do ask, that's fine. You know, you're still there. And in my experience, it is impossible to have too many signs. A lot of people will overlook things, not on purpose, obviously. They just kind of are overtaken by everybody's beautiful art and they can't, they forget to kind of look for the pricing. And so I found that you can never have too many signs. So go overboard, just put whatever you want to tell your consumers. So prices are the most important thing, but you can put whatever you want there. Okay, so kind of to summarize your setup, again, the most important thing about your setup is that your items are visible from far away or just, you know, by people who are just kind of passing by. Make sure that everything is pretty easily visible so things can catch people's eyes. But some of the things that you should consider when choosing your setup materials is first and foremost weight and bulk. So you don't want something that is too bulky. For example, if there is this like actual shelf, you know, that might look absolutely great on your table, but do you really want to bring this giant shelf with you when you go to a convention? It's just not very portable. And so if, you know, I personally try to keep my stuff as small as possible so they fit in my suitcase. You might not have to do that, but still you might want to consider not making your display too big. Weight is also really important if you're, especially if you're traveling by plane or by bus, where they have limits to how heavy something is. And even if they don't have a limit, you don't want to bring something that is too heavy because you're the one who is setting up your table and you don't want to tire yourself out, you know, before the con even starts. So, some things to keep in mind. Some other things to consider about your setup is how easy it is to set up or tear down. Um, Usually, you are given kind of the night before a convention to set up. So, in total, I think you get about 6, 7 hours maximum usually for your setup. And so, if it takes you longer than that, you might kind of want to rethink your setup. Also, for teardown, you're usually given, I think, somewhere between 2 to 3 hours. There are actually conventions that will kick you out after a certain time because they've only booked the convention until a certain time. And so you don't want to be, you know, stuck at the convention still trying to tear things down when everybody's trying to leave. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Cost is a really important one. You don't want to start out with the most expensive of displays. That's just, I mean, you could, but that is a lot of startup costs that you'll have to keep in mind. And the last thing that I want to talk about for setup is overall branding and aesthetic. So it's generally a good idea to keep kind of a uniform aesthetic. So I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but all of my stuff is either generally either white or teal or some kind of like natural wood or cork color. And to be entirely honest, I never meant to have an aesthetic when I first started. I just really, really like this mint teal-ish light green kind of color. And before I knew it, everything that I had bought for my setup was that color. So that's just kind of my aesthetic at this point. But there are people who do like really sparkly, dark, kind of gothic kind of style. I've seen people do very cute pastel. And so if you have a really nice overarching aesthetic, generally it makes your table look a little bit more clean and professional, a little bit easier to look at. And maybe it'll catch somebody's eye. So, one last thing I do want to talk about setup is that uh, if you are just starting out, it's a good idea to kind of test your setup at home. You can kind of imagine where things will go in your head, or maybe you'll kind of draw it out, but it's really never the same as when you actually have it out in real life and kind of see it in person. So it's a good idea to kind of test it out at home or something before actually going with that setup, so that you can make sure that all of your prints and all of your items are laid out in a way that you want it to. So testing and practices are really good. Okay. I also want to talk about what to do if you have a shared table. So I mentioned in the last part about applying with shared tables. So if you are just starting out, it might be a good idea to share with a friend or something like that. And that way you decrease the cost for everybody, and it is also a good way to decrease your stresses for going into a big convention or maybe your first one. So there's kind of a spectrum of how you want to do a setup for shared tables. So on the left here, I have completely separate. So this is when you have like your 6 foot or 8 foot table, and your friend has their own section and they have their own branding, own, PVC pipes or whatever, completely separate, their own pricing and everything. And then you have your half with all of your items and all of your prints and merchandise and stuff like that. Again, completely separate from your friends, but you guys are on a single table. So this is a really good idea when the items that you have and your friend has are either completely different or have very different pricing, or just really different branding in general. That's a good idea. I've also seen it done when people don't have the same number of inventory. So one person might have a huge amount of stuff, so they'll have kind of like a little bit bigger space and kind of set themselves on their own, and then their friend will kind of take a smaller space on the side or something like that. So here I have a quick image of when I went to Anime Central. So this is artwork and products made by Omona. And at the time, I had an 8 foot table, and I had used about 5 feet of that table, and then they had used about 3 feet of the table. And they had brought a lot of sweatshirts, charms, and stuff like that. And for those of you who do know her artwork, you guys might know that our styles are very different. So she has very cute, very charming, like really adorable stuff, and mine is more of like an illustration heavy style. And so it made a lot more sense to us for us to just completely separate everything. And so she has her little booth and I have my little booth. So on the opposite spectrum, on the right here, is a shared setup where everything is completely mixed. So if you do have a print wall, maybe all of your prints are completely mixed together. And if you have charms, maybe all of your charms are kind of interspersed with each other. And that's a good idea when you and your friend are like really close and your styles are really similar, or if you want to separate your items by item type or fandom rather than by different people. So this is a quick image I have here of when I went to Anime Central the year before the other picture. I'm at Anime Central quite often. This one I had shared the table with Lucid Sky, and if you can tell, we have this giant, giant table, and we have some of these prints I have are here kind of interspersed among her prints. So this was actually, I think, I was like a year, maybe a year and a half into the convention scene, and I didn't actually have a whole lot of stuff. And so, in order for me to not look like I was completely overwhelmed by her stuff, we thought maybe it would be a good idea to kind of intersperse everything together like that. So usually what happens is kind of this middle ground between having completely separate and completely mixed stuff, where people will kind of separate their items half and half, and then but just put everything kind of together. So all of the prints will still be kind of together, but one half would be this one person, the other half would be this other person. And usually people will kind of share deals. So if they do like buy two, get one free deals, then a lot of times people will say, oh, you can kind of pick from from either side of the table, and it's a really good way to kind of help each other with the convention, kind of help out with the stress or the sales or packing and stuff like that. So that's generally what happens. Okay, so I got a quick question. So Fish says, sorry to interrupt, that's okay. When you set up the day before the convention, do you leave your extra prints or luggage overnight at the convention? So that's a good question. I'll actually talk a little bit more about this when we actually talk about selling at the convention. But a quick answer for now, I personally just leave everything under the table. Um, Usually convention halls are locked and protected, so there isn't a lot of worries about having things taken. If it is an open hall and there's no locked doors, and or if it's like a 24-hour convention, it is a much better idea to kind of take all your valuables with you. But otherwise, usually conventions are locked at night, or locked any time when the convention is not open, when the artist alley is not open. So it's perfectly fine to leave them at the table. That's what I do. So, okay. Let's kind of move on. So we've kind of covered everything about the setup. Now I kind of want to talk about the stuff that you should bring to the convention to promote yourself. So this is, if you're at a convention, you're kind of selling or promoting your own artwork or your own craft. And so you want to make sure that the information, your artist information, is really easy for everybody to find. So there's two common ways of doing this. The first one is business cards. So, that's pretty self-explanatory. You have these little cards that you lay flat out on the table, and people can kind of grab them if they're interested. Another one is signs and banners. So you can print out these big signs, or in my case, I have just this like little tabletop sign that I put in front of my table that has all of your information and kind of where the attendees can find you online and stuff like that. In this picture, I have banners everywhere, but that's not necessarily something that you have to do. I don't actually recommend doing this because it's kind of overwhelming. This is just to kind of show you where you can put it. So sometimes you can put it almost like above your prints as like a banner. Some people put it in front of their table, kind of off the edge. Some people, like me, will have these little tabletop signs, and then some other people will have these like little pull down banners that you can either set on the table or on the ground. So I think these kind of banners are a little bit more common in the Comic Con scene compared to the Artist Alley scene, but it's something that is definitely open for you to do. So some of the information that you should have either on your business cards or your signs is your artist name or your real name, if you want to share that. For me personally, I just don't share my real name, but that's my personal preference. It's a really good idea to have your artwork on it, especially if it's a business card. Sometimes people will grab a business card, but then they'll forget later where they got that business card. And so if you have your artwork or a picture of your craft or something like that, it makes it a lot easier for them to remember, oh, this is from the table with a lot of Kingdom Hearts or something like that. I tend to be that one table with a lot of Kingdom Hearts. But yeah, it's also really good to put all of your social media so that your attendees or fans can come find you later on the internet. And if you have websites or online stores, that's definitely something to keep on there. If you are like a freelancer, then it is probably a really good idea to put your professional email address on there also, so then people can kind of contact you for commissions or stuff like that. So I kind of forgot to mention this when we talked about the signs and banners, but usually what happens with signs and banners is that people will take pictures of your sign if you don't have business cards. And so just make sure that that is something you are comfortable with. And if people ask about it, let them know if that's okay or if it's not or something like that. So really the point of all of this, business cards or signs or banners or anything like that, is to make it easy for the attendees to remember you. So make it generally kind of easy to read. Okay. And actually, I do kind of want to talk about my personal experience with either business cards or signs or banners. I used to do business cards, so this was like one of my older business card designs. I actually don't do them anymore because what I saw was that a lot of people will kind of walk down the aisle and collect business cards without necessarily actually looking at your artwork or even being interested in it. They just kind of collect it, which I'm sure, maybe they just don't have time and they want to check out everybody later, or, they just like, pretty artwork business cards or something like that. But for me, I was going through like hundreds and hundreds of business cards, like per convention, because they're free to take. And so, unfortunately, I felt that it was not worth it for me to keep printing out all of this business cards, and they're really heavy to carry too because it's like thick paper. So I actually just moved to signs where I just have a little sign that says you can take a picture of me, and it has all of my information and stuff, and that way people will just take a picture if they're interested, and if they have a picture that's not something that I personally have to print out, and it's also something that they won't have to lose, because a lot of times I've heard that people will just accidentally lose a business card, and people do lose their phones, but it happens a little less often than losing business cards. So that's my personal experience. Of course, everybody's experience is different. So that's just me. Okay, now let's start talking about the actual money aspect of things. So when you're at a convention, obviously you are trading your goods, your artwork and hard work for payment from the attendees. So there's three main types of payment. The most common one, and the one that usually people think about when they think about conventions, is cash. If you are taking cash, just make sure that you have enough change. So usually a good number to go with is like 50 to $100 in change, meaning like $1 bills or $5 bills, something small like that. Um, Especially if you have merchandise that is priced in a way that doesn't fall exactly on the five. So, for example, if I'm selling something for like $12, then most time people are probably going to give me like a 10 and a 5 for 15, or just like a $20 bill. And so I just need to make sure that I have enough change to give back, in ones and things like that. So that's something that you can get if you just go to the bank, just be like, hey, I need $51 bills, and they'll pull it out of your bank account, or you'll trade it in for your other cash or something like that. Another payment method that is getting really, really common is card. So when you have a card purchase, what happens is you have to download some kind of card reader, and you have to set your account up with it, where you kind of either tell them like your PayPal information or your bank account, and it comes with this little chip, this little card reader, and I actually have it. So give me one sec. Do 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 do. Aha. Okay, so here's a little card reader. Ta-da! Oh, I feel like one of those like makeup gurus on YouTube that does this. Okay, it's not focusing. But this is a little chip reader, so it has a little headphone jack like this. So if you have one of those iPhones with that headphone jack, you'll have to get that like weird extension thing. But this will go into your phone through the headphone jack, and it has a slidey thing here where you can slide your card. Um, and so you can basically take payment like that. The One of the most important things when you're doing this is to make sure you have signal to the internet. So either through data or maybe Wi-Fi at the convention center. If you do that, then every time you swipe, the system will check the card information in its big database or something like that, and make sure that it's an actual card and not like a fraudulent card. If you are offline, unfortunately, sometimes it's a lot harder to check. And so I've personally never had an issue with fraud, but it might be an issue. The other thing that I do want to mention is that this little person here, this little card reader, is only a swipe reader and not a chip reader. And unfortunately, there has been a law that was passed that says that if you are accepting credit card payments and you are swiping a chip card and that card happens to be fraudulent, then the bank cannot cover for that fraudulent cost. It'll basically come out of your own pocket. And so, because of that, there are newer credit card readers that actually read the chips. I actually have one, but I'll have to dig it out, so I'm not going to do that. Those are actually a little bit pricier. So those are, I bought mine for about $40. It's a Square reader. But these little ones tend to be free. So if you're just starting out with a little convention and you're not really sure, if you sign up for Square, this one will be shipped to you free of charge. So I already mentioned Square, which is a company that most people use, I think, in the convention scene. But there's also things like PayPal has their own swiper and card reader. Trying to think of other companies. Usually Square and PayPal are like the biggest ones. Okay, so the final method of payment that I have personally taken is electronic. So this is stuff like Venmo, PayPal, stuff like that, where you are electronically sending the money without the use of like a credit card or any cash. And I will say this is really uncommon, and I've only ever used it in the case where my internet basically cut off and I couldn't connect to the system for Square. Um, and usually you can use it in offline mode, the Square readers, but there are some cases where it just won't let you do anything. And in those kind of cases, unfortunately, you either have to ask uh, the customer to either give you cash, which if they don't have cash, they might have to go to an ATM and come back, or to give you some kind of electronic payment. So I've personally taken payments through PayPal. They'll just kind of like go on their, smartphones and go to the PayPal account and kind of send you the money. And once you get it, you can, say, thank you very much, here's your product, or something like that. So it's not very common, but I will mention it because it is something that I've personally done and it might be something that the customer might suggest. So for all of these methods, so cash, card, electronic payments, fraud has happened, not to me personally, but I have heard stories where fraudulent cases happen. So just make sure that you are taking the precautions necessary to kind of prevent yourself from that. So if you are taking cash, just make sure you know exactly what a $20 bill looks like, because I've heard of cases where they will take like a $5 bill, but then just change the numbers to 20 in some way. Apparently that looks realistic, but they're not going to change, the Abe Lincoln to, Alexander Hamilton, right? That's a 20, I think. I think it's Alexander Hamilton. No, maybe that's a 10. I can't remember. Oh no, Jackson. Jackson is on the 20. I'm sorry. I don't know my money apparently. So in the US dollar bills, just make sure that you know what they look like. There are also anti-fraudulent pens where it's like a highlighter and you kind of draw on the cash, and if it like comes up as a certain color, it's telling you that this is a fraudulent cash bill or something like that. For card, again, if you do really want to protect yourself, go with like a chip reader. And for electronic payments, just make sure that you actually get the money before you actually give the item to someone. So just make sure you're taking all the precautions. Oh, and I do want to mention one more thing about cash, and that is that if you do take cash, which basically everybody is probably going to take cash. That is about, I think, 70-80% of all transactions in the artist alley. You do need some kind of place to put it. So you can put it in like a little pouch. Some people have like a little box. I personally recommend against getting a like metal cash box because unfortunately, if you look at a metal cash box, it looks like a cash box. And so even if it is locked or something like that, there's nothing preventing the person from just taking the entire box. So I prefer to go a little bit more subtle and just kind of put it in a predetermined pouch. Okay. So that's all the stuff about payments. Next, let's talk about seller's permit and sales tax stuff. So all of the adult logistic things that has to do with Artist Alley. And so there's three main methods of doing seller's permits or sales tax. The first one is a semi-permanent seller's permit. So this is still technically considered a temporary seller's permit, but you have to report back to the system every season. And by season, it can vary between half a year, it can be like 3 months, it can be like 1 month. It really depends on the state. But basically, you'll have to kind of go back to the system and be like, hey, between January and March, I didn't make any money in this state. At all or something because you didn't have a convention or something like that. So Pennsylvania, for example, or Texas does semi-permanent seller's permits. So this is something that you will have to go online and apply for beforehand, and every season kind of come back to them and report back and say, hey, this is how much money I made or something like that. The second tax method is a single time temporary seller's permit. So this is a one-time tax. So you tell the system, the state, hey, I'm going to be selling for this duration of time at this one place, and after that I will give you the money. So California does this. So you basically just fill out a form beforehand, get some kind of seller's permit. It's like a one-time sheet of paper. And after that, you basically have to go back to the system and be like, okay, I made this much money, and here's the tax for it. And the last one, I think this one is the least common out of all of the tax logistics, is a post-event sales tax. And by that, I mean you don't need to apply for a seller's permit beforehand. I think Illinois does this. Correct me if I'm wrong. Everybody should do their own research, by the way. Don't take my words as like absolute fact. I think Illinois does this where you basically sell at a convention and then the state will trust you to come back after the event and go to their system and be like, hello, I sold at this place on this date and this is how much money I made. Here is the sales tax for it, sort of a thing. And so, again, every state is extremely different on the way they do their sales tax. So it is really annoying, and frankly, this is like the most annoying part of Artist Alley is taxes. But make sure you do your research and make sure you're not like breaking any rules. Regarding actual conventions and how they enforce it, most conventions don't actually enforce any of this stuff. So sometimes they'll just kind of say, oh, you should have a seller's permit, but they're not going to check. There are conventions that will require you to have it, and then, for example, Anime Expo, they will expect you to bring your California tax seller's permit to the convention, and they'll kind of go around asking everybody for it so that they can make sure that everybody is kind of following rules. Um, or, for example, Anime Boston actually requires you to give them your tax seller's permit information beforehand, before the convention. So, again, they know that everybody is following rules. But most conventions just kind of trust you on it. Usually on their like contract, they'll say like, "Oh, you make sure you have your seller's permit and make sure you do the necessary taxes for this." But they won't enforce it. They'll just kind of trust you on it. So this is all for state tax. Federal tax, you'll basically have to do at the end of the year, with your regular taxes. So that's something that I am not going to really cover. That kind of falls into freelance category. It's a little bit outside of the convention category. So I recommend everybody do their own research, but just remember that sales tax is definitely a thing. Okay. So here is some of the checklists uh, that I personally think is a good idea to have when you go to a convention. So you want to make sure you're prepared at the convention. Technically, if you are missing something, you can go out and buy it, but it's kind of annoying to keep having to go like, oh no, I forgot this one thing and have to go out of the convention center and go get it or something like that. So it's a good idea to make little lists for yourself and then make sure that you have everything that you think you'll ever need. So some of the stuff that I have written here, so for example, on the setup checklist, I have things like scissors, tape, markers for making signs, extra paper for making signs, an extra tablecloth. I didn't actually mention this, but uh, I said earlier that you have a lot of people will have like their own tablecloth to cover their table. It's also a good idea to have a second tablecloth, just in case that first one, either gets ripped or you spill something on it or you can't use it for whatever reason. And you can use it to cover your table at the end of a convention. So I'll actually talk about that in my next section, but for now, extra tablecloths are great. For the administrative checklist, some things that you should have are things like money pouches. For me, I actually use a little fanny pack. So for me, I have to bring my little fanny pack. Your official ID, so the convention can make sure that you are who you say you are. Your tax ID, if they require it. Things like notebooks and pens, especially if you're taking inventory. Again, these are all things that I'll talk about in the next section, but I kind of want to put them in here because this is the preparation section. If you are taking credit card payments, make sure to bring your card reader. And in this day and age, we all run on our phones. Our phones are like our personal secretaries and lives, and so external batteries are really important. Some people bring like two. I just have one, but external batteries are extremely important. And the final checklist list that I have here is self-care. So it is a convention and you are selling, but you really need to remember that you should take care of yourself and your health. And so these are some of the things that will help you. Snacks for when you can't really leave your table and you're starting to get hungry. Water is a really big thing. Water is very important. Keep yourself hydrated. Hand sanitizer is a really big one. You're constantly dealing with people and you're constantly taking money, especially cash, and cash can be really, really dirty. And so hand sanitizer is a must. Medication, if you need anything like Tylenol, ibuprofen, if you have, any like other medication that you really need to take, those are all really important to bring. The last thing I will say is layers. So sometimes you don't really know how cold or hot a hall is going to be. Even if it's really hot outside, it might be really cold inside the convention hall. So it's generally a good idea just to dress in layers so that if it gets hot, you can take it off. And if it's getting a little cold, you have something to put on. So again, everybody will be really different in the kind of stuff that you'll bring to a convention, but these are just some general ideas that you guys can kind of think about to bring. Okay, and I have one final slide for this part, and that is traveling. So if you are traveling to a convention, um, especially if it's a long distance one, you will have to do quite a bit of planning beforehand to make sure that you get there on time and everything goes smoothly. So there's three main ways to get there. So you can get there by car or by bus or train, some kind of public transportation, and the final one is by plane. So, if you are willing to drive to your convention, if it's close by, that's great. But if it's something like 3, 4, 5, 6 hours away, and you are driving by car, make sure you are prepared for any car trouble. So it's a really good idea to have something like AAA, something that can help out when your car breaks down in the middle of the highway or something like that. It's a really good idea. And it's also a good idea if you're kind of on your own or something to not really drive at night, just for safety precautions and things. And if you need your GPS, make sure you are, if you're using like Google Maps, make sure that your phone can be charged on the way and things like that. If you're taking a bus or train, some kind of public transportation, a lot of times their luggage will have weight maximums. So I think the Megabus, you are allowed one big luggage, and I think it has to have a maximum limit of like 50 pounds. So just make sure that you are aware of these kind of rules, and make sure you know exactly where you are going in order to get on the Megabus. And even once you get to your destination, make sure that you have a way for you to get from the Megabus stop to your actual convention center. Just kind of be aware of where the bus is going to drop you off. And finally, by plane. So planes will really vary between every company, obviously. But if you are bringing a lot of things to sell, you probably have to check your luggage in. Usually for a domestic flight, the first luggage that you want to check in will be $25. The second one will be 75, I believe. And both of them usually have a 50-pound limit, and beyond that, it gets overcharged, and it can get really expensive. So just watch out for that. Again, there are exceptions. I think Southwest actually has their first bag checked in bag for free. So I know a lot of artists that are very, very loyal to Southwest just because, it really adds up. So just be aware of those kind of things. And so also, if you are flying by plane, make sure that your ID will work. So I'm from Minnesota originally, and so my license is still a Minnesota license. And actually, starting I think next year, I will no longer be able to use my license as an actual ID because it doesn't follow like the federal ID laws or something like that. This is kind of complicated, but just make sure, look up, do some research, make sure your ID is okay to go on planes if you haven't flown before or something like that. Um, and the last thing I do want to mention about traveling is that remember the amount of time it takes you to get to a convention is also considered part of the cost of going to a convention. So that's opportunity cost. So if it takes you 6 hours to get to a convention, that's 6 hours that you could have spent like making merchandise or something like that. So make sure that you kind of balance out the costs and the amount of time it gets there, or it takes to get there and stuff like that. Okay, so that's actually the end of this part 3 of this series that's gotten way longer than I was originally planning it to be. Again, I'll start like taking any kind of questions if you guys have any. And yeah, I do just want to reiterate that everything that I say is just based on my own personal experience and it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. Everybody should do their own research and kind of find whatever works best for them. So that's it for my talk today. It's 11:30 and we're about an hour and a half in, so I don't think I'll get to the next section, but I can kind of like show sneak previews. Let's see. This is like, I'll start talking about things like, oh, that's my alarm, sorry. things like general convention schedule, things like space etiquettes. Basically, the next section will be everything, or everything that I think is really important on things to do at the actual convention. So please stay tuned. That'll be next Friday. hmm Okay,